This is a 1994 Jaguar XJ220, and it is one of my all-time favorite cars. That's because it isn't just a supercar, it's a weird supercar. You see, cars like the Ferrari F40 and the Aventador and the Bugatti Veyron, everybody knows about them. They get all the press. But this car is just as special, and yet it isn't as celebrated or as well known. But today, you're going to know about it because I'm going to do something I have always wanted to do. I'm going to review the XJ220. I've borrowed this XJ220 from AUTOSPORT Designs, which is here on Long Island in New York. AUTOSPORT Designs has one of the best inventories of any dealerships I have ever been to, a truly amazing mix of cars. They also supplied the Aston Martin Lagonda that I reviewed, so of course it would be AUTOSPORT Designs that would have an XJ220. So let's talk XJ220. First, the basics. This is a mid-engine supercar, and Jaguar made about 280 of these for the entire world during this car's production run from 1992 to 1994. Now, it was named the XJ220 because it could theoretically hit 220 miles an hour, although that never actually happened. Magazine tests at the time weren't able to get past about 210, and even when Jaguar removed the catalytic converters and the rev limiter, they could only get it up to 217, but no faster. And that wasn't the only undelivered promise with the XJ220. Now, when the XJ220 was first shown as a concept car in 1988, it had a mid-mounted V12, scissor doors, all-wheel drive, and rear-wheel steering. When the production version came out 4 years later, the rear-wheel steering was gone, the all-wheel drive was gone, the scissor doors were gone, and the mid-mounted V12 had been swapped out for a turbocharged V6. Potential customers were really angry and they sued Jaguar to get their deposits back. But even with all the changes, the XJ220 still performed. The engine made 540 horsepower and 475 pound-feet of torque, and this was the fastest production car in the world for 1 year until the McLaren F1 came along and beat it. Unfortunately, the market didn't really seem to care. Jaguar had a ton of trouble selling the XJ220, and they ended production early in 1994 after selling about 280 units. In the years since, this has been kind of a forgotten supercar. Prices have stayed low, and there hasn't really been all that much interest from collectors until recently. In the last few years, prices have started to rise up above $500,000, and they're going up from there as collectability for this car has increased. And with that, it's time to review the XJ220. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this car, and I'm going to show you all of the interesting quirks and features of one of my all-time favorite supercars. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the XJ220, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've rounded up a list of some other forgotten 1990s supercars. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the XJ220 by talking about simply getting inside. And that means I start with the key. Now, the XJ220 used a fairly standard Jaguar key for the time, but it's still cool to see. It has the cat on top, and then it's a cylinder, which was very different from basically every other flat key at the time. Now, another cool thing about getting into the XJ220 is the door handle. You can see it here. It's this little half circle on the door and then this sort of oval piece on the bodywork. You stick your hand in there and pull it, and that's how you open the doors to the XJ220. But none of that stuff is the craziest thing about getting into the XJ220. One of the craziest things is the alarm. If you leave your XJ220 unlocked and parked for a while, the alarm will arm itself. And obviously the alarm will arm itself if you lock it. Then, when you go and try to open the door or break into the XJ220, it provides a tremendously intimidating alarm sound. This'll stop the thieves. No one's stealing your XJ220 now. Anyway, to stop that, you press this little button on the key fob that unlocks the door, and then you can climb in. Unfortunately, climbing into the XJ220 is easier said than done. And I say this because the XJ220 has one of the craziest door situations I've ever seen. Specifically, the door only opens to here. This is the fully opened door. Now, that may look to you like enough room to get in. It looked like it to me when I first saw it open, but when you actually try to climb in, you'll see the problem. There's just not all that much space to actually get in to this car. But if you just wedge yourself enough, you can make it in. I have no idea why the door doesn't open wider. One of the quirks of the XJ220. But once you get inside, you are very much rewarded because there are many more quirks of the XJ220 to explore, starting with the Dorsal, which is truly insanely massive, absolutely ridiculous. You have to climb over that. It is so wide. There's so much material there. But you'll also see on the Dorsal that this car says 128. I guess that's the production number, the assembly number of this particular XJ220. And it says that on both the driver's side Dorsal and the passenger side Dorsal. So you can brag to your passenger which number your XJ220 is. Now, once you've climbed over that Dorsal, probably the first thing you notice when you get in this car is above you, there's a sunroof. This is something I never knew about the XJ220. It has a glass roof. Now, this roof does not open, and here's the kicker, there's no sunshade. So you can see I'm like sweating, it's a hot day, the sun is beating through here, and there's nothing I can do about that. This car was made in the UK. They don't really have hot sunny days there, so they don't think of such things. And this fixed sunroof with no cover is the result of that. And speaking of windows, let's discuss the ones in the door. To control them, you have window switches in the middle in the center console, and they function like normal window switches. Push them down, the window rolls down. The interesting thing about the windows, though, around the edge of the door, you can see there's this black molding or trim on the door. That's pretty common. But what's not so common, when you roll the window all the way up, it actually rolls up above that trim on the door, which I don't think I've ever seen before. Usually that trim acts as a water seal so stuff doesn't get in, but in this car, the windows go above it. Not really sure why or what the deal is there, but that's how the XJ220 works. And speaking of the windows rolling up and down, it's worth noting that when the windows roll down, they don't roll down all the way. They get close, but not quite all the way down the XJ220. Now, next up, I want to talk about the gauge cluster in the XJ220. You can see it's a very no-nonsense thing. There's not a bunch of weird like logos or anything strange in there. It's just a straightforward, simple gauge cluster, and you can see it's in kilometers per hour. The XJ220 was never sold new in North America, in the United States. It did not comply with US regulations. Now, that meant you couldn't actually import an XJ220 until it became 25 years old to comply with US regulations, but over the years, many XJ220s were brought in under the show or display exemption, which allows you to bring in certain significant low production cars for show or display purposes, and this is one of those cars that was brought here under show or display. Now that the XJ220 is 25 years old, though, you can import them at will. But anyway, back to the gauges. In the gauge cluster area, you can see there are 6 gauges. You have the speedometer, the tachometer, normal. Then you have oil pressure, oil temperature, the fuel gauge, and the engine temperature gauge, all pretty standard, but there are additional gauges beyond those, and they're mounted on the driver's door panel. The XJ220 has 4 more gauges mounted over on the driver's door panel. Very unusual. You won't see that in a lot of cars, but you will see it in this one. The 4 gauges are, you have a clock, you have the battery voltage meter, you have the boost gauge, since this is a turbocharged car, and you have what I think is the transmission temperature readout. I think that's what that little display is trying to signify, and those are the 4 additional gauges. And when you close the door, you can see they kind of get snug in there, and it gives the driver sort of a cockpit feel because you have all these gauges now surrounding you coming off the door panel. It's actually a really cool look. Now, speaking of the driver's door panel, it's worth noting that that door panel has a leather padded surface designed for you to be able to rest your arm while you're driving. But since the door sill is so wide, you can't actually reach it. You wouldn't be able to actually rest your arm over there unless you reached over to do it, so that space is kind of useless. It's worth noting though that also in the door panel area you have a little storage compartment lined in velvet where you can put stuff like a wallet or sunglasses while you're driving. One other interesting item worth noting in the door panel, you have the door latch, which is frankly a pretty standard door latch. You just pull it, open the door, nothing special or unusual about that. Now next up, moving further into the car, another interesting item you see is the steering wheel, and in the very middle you have this angry Jaguar cat logo that they were using at the time. You push the middle of the steering wheel and that's the horn. So what does the horn sound like in a Jaguar XJ220? Well, take a listen. Now, coming off of the steering column, like in most cars, you have the stalks for the wipers and the turn signals. There's nothing especially unusual here, except the turn signal stalk also contains the headlights. There's a little switch on the turn signal stalk that allows you to turn on the headlights, which is kind of strange. But otherwise it operates like a normal turn signal stalk. And over on the right, you have the wiper stalk, which operates like a fairly normal wiper stalk. It also has a switch, but that allows you to control the speed of the intermittent wipers, which is pretty standard stuff. Nothing too unusual there. Now, next up, I want to talk about the mirrors. The power mirror control is to the left of the steering column, and it's a fairly standard little thing. It's a switch, you turn one direction or other, and then you move it around to move the mirrors. Pretty simple, but the mirrors aren't as simple as they seem at first glance. Check this out. On the driver's side, you can see I open the door and the mirror stays put because it's mounted on the fender. On the passenger side, I open the door and the mirror moves because it's mounted on the door. The mirrors in this car are in two different places, which is something you don't see very often. And the reason for that is if they had mounted the passenger mirror on the fender, it would be blocked by the A-pillar if you were actually trying to see behind you. So they had to pull the mirror forward, and that way you can actually see out of it when you're driving the XJ220. And next up, we move on to the startup procedure for this car, which is rather unusual. To start it, first you put the key into the ignition and turn it, which is pretty standard, but then you press this unlabeled red button next to the ignition, and that actually fires it up and starts the car. It's sort of a precursor to all the engine start buttons that we have today. Next up, another interesting item here in the center console. You can see obviously this car is a manual. All XJ220s had a manual transmission, and strangely enough, it is a 5-speed manual and not a 6-speed. Performance cars were starting to gain 6-speed manuals in the early 90s, but Jag went with a tried and true 5-speed for whatever reason. Another interesting item in here is the seats. You can see they say XJ220 at the top, which is very cool. They're these nice heavily bolstered seats, but not too thickly bolstered, and I really like the look of them and the feel of them. They're pretty good. They are manually controlled, not power seats, so if you want to move them around, you do have to pull levers and that sort of thing. But those are the seats in the Jaguar XJ220. And our next interesting item in the driver footwell, you have the pedals down there, obviously. Interestingly, 2 of the pedals have the letter J on them. The clutch pedal and the brake pedal both say J. I guess J for Jaguar. I'm not sure how many people will even notice. I'm not sure why they chose J and not like the cat logo or nothing, frankly. But that's what this car has. The pedals say J. Now you know. And next up, our next interesting quirk in the XJ220 is the dome lights. They're mounted on this panel that's basically stuck on the sunroof. In the middle, you have one giant dome light. That's the one that turns on when you open the doors. And over on the sides, you have individual personal reading lights. You press these little buttons and then they will turn on so you can read while you're driving along in your XJ220. And next we move on to the climate control situation in the XJ220. Now, the climate controls themselves are pretty normal, pretty standard, just these 3 dials in the middle that look like what you would have gotten in basically any other car in the 1990s. But the climate vents are rather unusual. I'll start with the fact that the driver has 4 of them. You have 2 over on the left and 2 over on the right. 4 individual climate vents just for the driver, which personally seems to me like maybe a little bit overkill, although I have to admit it does help balance out some of the effect of the giant sunroof. Now, the passenger side also has 2 individual climate vents, and you can see they're placed over on the dashboard right where an airbag would be. The XJ220 has no passenger side airbag. Instead, you got those climate vents, which was a decision you were probably thrilled about. It kept you comfortable right up until you got into an accident, and then you wished they had made a different decision. Now, speaking of the passenger side of the interior of the XJ220, there are a lot of other interesting items in the passenger side, starting with the grab handle. This is coming off the center console, and you can see you can fit your hand around it so that you can grab on for dear life when this car is going 220 miles an hour. 217 miles an hour. Another interesting item in the passenger side, again, you have that padded area where you can rest your arm while you're sitting there. And again, you have that little storage area inside the door where you can stick stuff. But the passenger side also has an additional storage area between the seat and the door sill. You can see there's another little velvet lined storage area where you can put really small items. Now, the driver's side does not have that. And the reason is the driver's side has the parking brake over on that side, which was the custom in 1990s Supercar to mount the parking brake between the driver's seat and the steering wheel. But on the passenger side, they use it for storage. And speaking of storage in the XJ220, one other item worth noting is that there is storage behind the seats. You can see there's a shelf here where you can stick stuff, and there's a little leather storage pouch where you can put other stuff that you don't want to fly around. Now, the storage behind the seats is a welcome addition in this interior because there's not much other storage. This car has no glove box where you can put stuff, and it also has no center console storage. So what you have behind the seats is basically the biggest storage you can get in the interior. And by the way, speaking of the passenger side, it's worth noting, obviously, this is a left-hand drive XJ220, but since the XJ220 was a British car and had a lot of buyer interest in Britain, so there were right-hand drive examples built as well, about 70 right-hand drive XJ220s compared to about 200 left-hand drive models like this one. Now, despite the fact that right-hand drive cars were the minority of XJ220s, that didn't stop Jaguar from putting all of the latches over there to open the various compartments throughout the car. So even though this is a left-hand drive car, all of like the hood latches, the trunk latches are over on the passenger side where they would make more sense in a right-hand drive car. So let's talk about those compartments. Now, the latch to open up the front compartment is in the passenger side footwell, and you can see it has a little image of an XJ220 with the front open. You pull it, and that pops open the front compartment, which obviously is the front trunk or the front luggage compartment, except when you open it, you realize that actually it is not a trunk. You can see it has 2 giant fans up here to help cool this car. And in fact, there is a warning label that specifically says, this isn't a trunk, don't put any luggage here because then the car will overheat. In fact, the label says it will severely overheat. It will be very bad. So you cannot use this front compartment for any sort of storage. It's just for these fans. So with that in mind, you're probably wondering, where exactly is the storage compartment in this thing? Well, it turns out the XJ220 has 2 rear hatches. One of them is the engine cover. You open that and get into the engine compartment. The other one is the actual luggage compartment, which is located right here. Now, in order to actually access these compartments, the little latches are behind the passenger seat over to the right, although it's worth noting that it's a latch to open up the engine compartment, but it's a button to open up the trunk, the luggage compartment. You press that button and then it unlatches the luggage compartment. Then you come around back here and you can open it right up, and that gives you access to the luggage compartment, the trunk, the boot of your Jaguar XJ220. Except, as you can see, it is tremendously small. It's a fairly wide surface area, but it does not go down very far. You don't have any space for basically anything. No way you could fit any sort of luggage back here, but you do have a little space to put tiny items. You also have an additional small storage compartment at the front of the cargo area, sort of up against the engine compartment, where you can put other small items if you don't want them to be in the larger area. And then next to that, you can see you have the CD changer. This is the cargo space you got when you got an XJ220. Anyway, next up, I'm gonna close up the trunk, and I'm going to move on to the exterior of the XJ220 because there is a lot to cover about the outside of this car, and I want to discuss its most obvious feature, or maybe quirk, and that would be its length. This vehicle is 194.1 inches long. That makes it only 4 inches shorter than a brand new Ford Explorer, which is a 3-row family SUV made 25 years later. If you compare the XJ220 to other supercars of its day, it's 2 feet longer than a Ferrari F40, and it's 2.5 feet longer than a Porsche 959, which is really amazing because the 959 has back seats, and this thing doesn't, and it's still 2.5 feet longer. This thing's massive size was undoubtedly a contributor to its poor sales. People saw how big this was and they just figured there was no way it could really be a nimble, exciting, kind of throw it around supercar, and so that was one of the factors that made them stay away and not buy it. It's just absolutely huge. And next up, moving on to some other exterior design elements of the XJ220, I want to start with this one. Now in Europe, it is mandated that you have turn signals on the sides of the car. A lot of cars integrate them into the mirrors. That's why you see so many cars with mirror turn signals. The XJ220 had no such integration. It was just a square orange mounted on the doors. There was no attempt to hide it or conceal it. It was there, that's what you got. Now, to me, it's always been really weird that they stuck that little orange square on the side of the car and made absolutely no effort to conceal that turn signal because they made so much of an effort to conceal the headlights. This car comes from the pop-up headlight era, but Jag didn't want to have boring, normal pop-up headlights, so instead you turn on the headlights and this happens. Now let's see that again. What's basically happening is this little cover over the headlights kind of retreats itself downwards, exposing the headlights so they can be turned on, and that's how this cover goes away and the headlights appear. Now, when you turn off the headlights, the cover goes back up and into place, and then the headlights are covered again and this car retains its aerodynamic shape. These are like the opposite of pop-up headlights. The lights are always fixed and the cover pops down in order to reveal them, a very, very cool design detail. And obviously when it's covered, it is a nice slippery shape for top speed runs. Now, one other interesting item regarding the lighting at the front of this car, the headlight compartment does not contain the turn signals because of course then it would have to do its little trick every time you put on the turn signal. So instead the turn signal is down here and it's very, very small and very, very low. You probably won't notice an XJ220 signaling if you have one coming up behind you. Now, when you move along to the back, you can see that the rear lights are also concealed in this car, though I'm not entirely certain why that is. You can see it has like normal brake lights, tail lights, reverse lights, turn signals, but then they're hidden behind this grille that covers up like half of their visible area. It's very strange. They could have just put the grille in the middle and kept the lights out, but they didn't. So those are the rear lights in a Jaguar XJ220. Now, next up, we move on to one of my other favorite exterior design details of this car, and that would be the wheels. I absolutely love this wheel design, mainly because it is the least supercar-like wheel ever fitted to a supercar in the long history of supercars. All exotic cars have these really aggressive, mean-looking wheels. This thing has these like dinner plate-looking things with all silver. They look like they should be on a Maybach or something like that, but instead they're on a 200-mile-an-hour supercar. I suspect the reason they did this is to give it as flat of a surface area as possible to make it as aerodynamic as possible, which then could make it achieve higher top speeds. Nonetheless, this is the wheel on the XJ220. 17-inch up front, 18-inch in back, and it has a 345 width rear tire. That was a really wide tire size back then, and it's still impressively wide today. This thing has massive tires. Now, next up, another absolutely amazing detail of this car is the rear antenna. A lot of 90s cars had antennas that went up when you turned on the radio. Not that unusual. Yes, you can see where I'm going with this. The XJ220 has it too. Turn on the radio and the antenna goes up like 5 feet from the body, and when it is up, it looks so stupid. It's just ridiculous that they put this antenna on a 200-mile-an-hour supercar, but they did, and that antenna goes up and down when you turn on and off the stereo. And next up, another cool item in the vicinity of the antenna, that would be the fuel door. You can see, for starters, that it just looks cool, but it also has a very cool operation. You stick your finger on this little tab that says Jaguar, you pull that down and then turn it to the side, and then you can pull off the little cap and insert fuel into your XJ220. Now, one interesting item is the fact that you can also lock it in case you were nervous that someone might try to steal fuel from your XJ220. Not sure how common that was, but you had the option. And next, another exterior item worth discussing, I want to talk about badging, because this car doesn't really have all that much. And in fact, you can see there's no badge right here that says exactly what it is. Instead, you had that angry cat badge a little lower. It was integrated into the small front grille in this car, and you can see there it is. Now, along the back, you had the brand name spelled out, Jaguar, above that rear grille, so you knew what it was if you were coming up behind it. My favorite badging, however, is right in front of the rear wheels. You can see it says XJ220. The only external XJ220 badge in this car. Looks very cool. Now, it's worth noting that the angry Jaguar logo also appeared in the center of this car's wheels. This car had center lock wheels, which was just becoming a thing in the supercar world when this car went on sale. And in the center of its center lock wheels, you have that angry Jaguar logo. And next up, we move on to the engine of the XJ220. And like I mentioned, it is a turbocharged V6, 3.5 liter turbo V6, 540 horsepower, 475 pound-feet of torque. And the first thing you notice when you look in the engine compartment of this car is just how much room there is left. That has struck me every time I've seen one of these. You could have put a V16 in here. And of course, indeed, it was Jaguar's original intent to put in a V12, but it was too costly and there were emissions certification problems, so they went with this turbo V6. Now, in the modern world, putting a smaller turbocharged engine in a supercar seems pretty reasonable. The new Ford GT has a turbo V6, but to give you some context, when this car was new, nobody was doing that. Everything had at least a V8, most of them had V12s, and coming out with a V6 just really disappointed a lot of people. And I think it really was the engine, not the lack of all-wheel drive or scissor doors, but the engine that drove this car's poor sales numbers. Now, to help combat the poor sales numbers, Jaguar came up with an idea. There was a race series with the XJ220 to try to drum up interest in this car. It was called Fast Masters, and they used retired racing drivers who weren't doing anything else. They brought them all out to Indianapolis and they had them race XJ220s. But the cars didn't run on the big Indy 500 oval track. Instead, they ran on a short track in the infield, which was a problem. Denise McCluggage, writing for Auto Week, said it was like running thoroughbred horses around your dining room table. The cars were way too big, and they were always crashing into each other with these old racing drivers at the wheel. These days, you can go on YouTube and find old clips from Fast Masters races with these Jaguar XJ220s bumping into each other. It's hilarious to watch. Anyway, the race series ended after only 5 races and a lot of damaged XJ220s. And finally, what would a thorough look at an XJ220 be if we didn't go through its accessories? AUTOSPORT Designs has this box of accessories that have stayed with this car since it was new, and I'm going to show you some of the highlights, starting with this first aid kit still in its plastic, the original Jaguar XJ220 first aid kit. That is an interesting item, and I sincerely wonder what's in there, though I'll leave it for the next owner to find out. Now, our next interesting item is this little white folder. It says XJ220 on the cover. You open it up and it is confirmation that you received an allocation of the XJ220. And you can see it says you have officially been allocated one of 350 cars. Of course, history tells us they only made about 280 cars. Like I mentioned, they had to cut production short. But this is what you got if you were lucky enough to get an XJ220. And finally, the last really interesting item in here, these books. These are the owner's manuals, and I really like the fact that they're silver, which is a really, really cool look. You get them into the sun and they have this really cool silver look to them. Now, on the very first page of the owner's manual, you can see again that 350 number. Only 350 of the limited edition XJ220 will be produced. Again, they didn't quite hit that number, but they printed it in the owner's manual. Now, I went through the owner's manual, not very big and nothing particularly interesting or unusual in here, although I do like on page 5 discussing the fire extinguisher. It says, the occupants of this vehicle are strongly recommended to familiarize themselves with the fire extinguisher operation. Well, of course they are. It's a British vehicle. Now, the other books here, you have the audio system owner's manual, you have the sales and service directory, and you have the book for European emergency assistance. Now, you open this up and it explains what to do in an emergency, what number you call in each European country, and it also says you should have the following information available: your name, your location, your Jaguar model, and then in parentheses it prints XJ220. Just in case you had forgotten that you were driving an XJ220, that is there, a nice little helpful hint to allow you to remember in case you break down. And so those are the quirks and features of the Jaguar XJ220. Now it's time to do it. It's time to get it out on the road and see how this thing drives. All right, driving the XJ220 and thereby fulfilling a childhood dream of mine. This is so cool. Now, the first thing you notice when you get in this car, I just was maneuvering in the parking lot, the steering is unbelievably heavy, just excessively, deeply heavy, to the point where you just hate your life. Even just a normal turn like that is surprisingly just difficult because the steering is just so heavy. Now, once you get going, obviously, which is the case in cars with no power steering, things even up and you're fine. Another thing I noticed, I wouldn't call the brakes bad, but you have to do a deep stab to really get stopped. You really have to push down on them, which is surprising to me in a car like this, although thinking back, F40 was a similar situation. And one interesting thing, you know, you drive this car and you think you're probably the only person on the planet who's driving one of these right now, which is not something I think about almost any of the cars I'm driving, no matter how rare. But this thing, there's only 280 of these, and not too many of them get driven. This one's only done 5,500 kilometers, like 3,000 miles. Now the sound, there's no question, is no V12. You know, by going with the Turbo 6, they obviously we're gonna lose some sound over what could have been a V12. Beyond that though, a lot of the people complain about the specific sound of this engine when this car was new, and it definitely doesn't have a V8, a V10, even a flat 6 sound to it. All right, now I'm sitting in heavy traffic here because of a train, so I'm just kind of creeping along. The clutch actually is not so bad. It is heavy, there's no doubt about that, but it's not as heavy as, it's not so bad that you can't go in heavy traffic. After a while, you probably would be tired of it, but it's not truly horrible like Countach. Also, it's worth noting there's surprisingly a lot of room. The pedal box has a decent amount of room. My knees are right up against the dashboard, but they're not hitting it. It is hot in here. The air conditioning and the climate vents, which I made fun of earlier for being so many of them, suddenly you start to understand why. Because it's just so damn hot because of the thing. Driving along, the car actually feels kind of like normal. This one is in really, really nice shape. And even just starting it and running it, which I was doing to film the part earlier, it starts on the first crank, it feels good. And I was surprised by that. I was thinking it was gonna be problematic. Maybe some of them are, but this one is nice and it drives like that too. Now driving this car on sort of a more curvy or higher speed road, you do start to actually appreciate the steering. The steering that was so annoying when I was driving it at low speeds, it remains heavy, and on curves, that's so nice. Obviously it lightens up from low speeds, but it just feels like you really are controlling the car, and so there's not much vagueness. There's a little on center, but not much. Yeah, rev match and downshift is not really all that hard. I'm taking it slow and trying to be careful because it's a valuable car and whatever, I don't want to mess anything up. But it's doable in this car, surprisingly so. It is surprising how much physical car is behind me. When I look in the mirror and see all that, it's like, wow, well, okay. The stories I've heard about this car and its turbocharging is clearly true. You don't get a lot of acceleration feel until the turbos start to kick in. And then things really do kind of heat up in terms of acceleration. But it does feel like an old school turbo car where you really have to get into it, and then it kind of blows you back. Wow. Wow. Wow, it goes. Steering starts to feel light. It goes. That is really some speed, surprisingly. Yeah, this car is not just 90s exotic car fast. This is still pretty fast. Yeah, it's interesting driving it around. It seems like most people don't really know or pay attention or care. It doesn't look like an Aventador or whatever. But if you know, you freak out. And I think a lot of car people do know. They're aware of this car. Most people have never seen one of these before. It's a really special treat to see one, to drive one, to be in one. I mean, it's so cool. I've always wondered about this car. I've always wondered about the 4 gauges on the door. And it's just cool to be able to see it in person and really experience it. And so that's the Jaguar XJ220. This is not one of the most nimble supercars ever made, given its large size, and it's not one of the most celebrated supercars ever made, since it's a Jaguar with a V6 and not a Ferrari or a Porsche or a Lamborghini or a Bugatti. But it is one of the most special supercars ever made, at least to me, and I've loved spending the day with the XJ220. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the XJ220 is beautiful, but its round styling dates it considerably, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is fine. It depends on what speed you're going. At low speeds, it's too heavy, and at high speeds, it's too light, but for most driving, it's pretty nice. It gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is high. The novelty of the car is huge, and the power delivery is amazing, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and this one's easy. Few cars are cooler, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 39 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It doesn't have much, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is okay. The cabin is pretty small. Entry and exit is hard, and that sunroof makes things get so hot, it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality is okay. The interior is nice enough, but reliability is a disaster. The main shop that works on these is in the UK, and that's a long way to send your car just for service, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Practicality is very, very low. The interior is small, the car is low and huge, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Finally, value, and I think these things could still go up in value given the low production numbers. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 18 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 57 out of 100, which places the XJ220 here among late 80s and early 90s exotic cars. It can't beat the real masters, the F40, the 959, the McLaren F1, but it edges out the more regular stuff. The XJ220 is way cooler than a Diablo or an F355, and the Jag is still shockingly fast.
You got good front visibility, big windshield. The mirrors are fine. You know, they could be bigger, I'm sure, but a lot of things could be different or better in life. There's a little life lesson. I've always felt it would be really funny to go to a Jag dealer, just roll up on a Saturday and be like, I'm an oil change waiter. Can you just...
The loaner.
Yeah, can I get an XE?
Loaner.
Okay, time to get... Oh. Oh.